Rising from the American landscape like brooding medieval fortresses, the psychiatric hospitals of the early 20th century were as imposing as they were isolated. These weren't just buildings, they were ideologies in stone. At the heart of their design was the Kirkbride Plan, a philosophy developed by psychiatrist Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride in the mid-1800s. His radical idea, that architecture itself could be curative. In his 1854 treatise on the construction of hospitals for the insane, Kirkbride insisted that the very walls, wings, and windows of a mental hospital should serve as instruments of healing. The result was a wave of sprawling asylums built across America, more than 70 in total, each costing around $2.5 million at the time, or roughly $60 million today. One of the most iconic of these institutions was the Buffalo State Hospital, designed in 1871 by famed architect Henry Hobson Richardson. Towering copper-capped spires rose 185 feet into the sky, set atop 2,200 feet of Medina sandstone walls. It was dubbed the Castle for its elaborate Victorian Gothic grandeur. Dr. James Dean, superintendent from 1900 to 1912, wrote in an annual report, "The very architecture speaks to the soul of the afflicted, reminding them of their separation from the world of the sane." Over 8 million bricks and 3 years of labor by 200 stonemasons birthed this mammoth structure. Though rumors swirled that Richardson himself had gone mad and was confined to an asylum, in reality, he died of Bright's disease in 1886. Buffalo State was not alone in grandeur, or in horror. The Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, rebuilt after a fire in 1901, stretched nearly a mile in linear design. Superintendent Dr. Hosea Quinby claimed this arrangement allowed for patient classification and better care, but diary entries from nurse Elizabeth Clark painted a much darker picture. "The halls echo with screams at night," she wrote in 1918. "The stench of unwashed bodies and soiled bedding pervades every corner." Designed for 1 in 200 patients, it often housed 1 in 800. The infamous violent ward locked human beings in 6 area 8-foot cells, where some languished for over a decade without ever setting foot outside. Further up in Massachusetts, perched atop Hathorne Hill, stood the Gothic terror of Danvers State Hospital, opened in 1878. Its main structure stretched 1,700 feet, the top central tower visible from miles away. A 1923 report by reformer Dorothea Dix described horrendous conditions. 40 patients crammed into dormitories built for 20, mattresses thin as paper placed directly on the floor, walls weeping with condensation, rats scurrying openly in the wards. Architect Nathaniel Bradley had embedded symbolism into every detail: 13 towers for the original colonies, tunnels stretching 2 miles underground, secretly ferrying deceased patients to the morgue. By 1939, Danvers housed 2,360 souls. The ratio? 1 doctor for every 250 patients. In New Jersey, the Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital stood as a monument to excess. Built in 1876, it became the largest continuous foundation building in the U.S., until the Pentagon. By 1927, 7,400 patients crammed into a space designed for far fewer. Author Mary Jane Ward, once a patient, described it in her semi-autobiographical novel, The Snake Pit. "We slept head to foot in rows so tight you couldn't walk between the beds. The air was thick with unwashed bodies and disinfectant. Construction had required 40 million bricks and 673,700 cubic feet of stone. A farm colony worked by unpaid patient labor made the hospital self-sustaining. Over 260,000 pounds of vegetables and 490 dairy cows produced yearly. Across state lines, Pilgrim State Hospital in New York surpassed them all. By 1954, it was the largest psychiatric hospital in the world, with over 14,000 patients. A 1925 schedule reveals a brutal routine: wake up at 5:30 a.m., cold bath by 6 GAO, breakfast at 6:30, and ward cleaning by 7. Yard time came at 8 GAO, weather permitting. Dr. William J. Tiffany, superintendent from 1931 to 1943, recorded that patients performed over 100,000 hours of unpaid labor monthly, worth about $25,000 in 1935 dollars. The kitchen produced 42,000 meals a day, powered by equipment so vast it could brew 600 gallons of coffee at once. Even the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, originally the Weston State Hospital, followed this model. Constructed. From hand-cut limestone blocks quarried by prison labor, each block weighing up to 800 pounds, it featured long, straight corridors for maximum patient visibility. High ceilings and large windows promised fresh air and light. But by 1938, it housed 2,400 patients in space meant for 250. Inspector Dr. Arthur Noyes wrote that conditions were more suited for cattle than human beings. Meanwhile, California's Camarillo State Mental Hospital, opened in 1936, opted for a Spanish colonial revival design rather than the Gothic norm. The facade was beautiful, sunlit courtyards and open-air corridors across 1,500 acres. But the charm was only skin-deep. Jazz legend Charlie Parker was treated there in 1946, giving rise to the hospital's nickname, the Last Resort. Attendant James Miller wrote in 1943 that patients were often left to sit in their own filth, some chained to benches for days. The hospital even had its own police force and fire department. By 1957, it held over 7,000 patients with 1-800 staff. In stark contrast, McLean Hospital in Massachusetts drew a sharp line between rich and poor patients. Wealthy individuals received private rooms and personal attendants, while the poor shared crowded dormitories. Poet Robert Lowell, treated there in 1958, captured the agony of this divide in his poem Waking in the Blue. Crows mourn on the petrified. Fareway. Absence makes my heart tense as though a harpoon were sparring for the kill. Superintendent Dr. Edward Cowles defended this disparity in his 1908 memoir, writing, "Different social classes require different accommodations to maintain their accustomed mode of living, which is essential to their recovery." In 1912, private patients paid $100 per week, or about $2,600 today, while state-funded patients cost just $350 per week. Even the Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan, known for its dazzling spires and Gothic windows, hid a grim reality. Journalist Nellie Bly once called it a palace for the mad. With over 1,000 uniquely arched windows and a full-time glazing crew, it looked like a cathedral. But its interior was filled with locked wards and cries echoing through barred halls. One patient, writing as Patient N82 in 1915, called it a glorified cage. Behind the towering walls and ornate facades of early 20th century psychiatric hospitals, a darker reality unfolded, one not of healing, but of control, coercion, and irreversible damage. Between 1900 and 1950, these institutions became laboratories for some of the most controversial and brutal medical experiments in American history. Treatments masked as cures often inflicted lasting trauma, sometimes worse than the mental illnesses they were meant to treat. The ethos of this era was shaped by places like the Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, notoriously known as Bedlam, where patients were once paraded before paying spectators. This twisted spectacle set the tone for many American institutions, where patients were not patients, but prisoners of medical authority. Few figures symbolize this era more than Dr. Walter Freeman, the self-declared father of the American lobotomy. Convinced that mental illness stemmed from overactive emotions, Freeman believed he could calm the mind by severing the connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. In 1946, he introduced the now infamous transorbital lobotomy, an ice pick-like instrument inserted through the eye socket. No operating room needed. Freeman performed over 3,500 lobotomies, often in hospital parking lots, traveling in his modified 1940 Chevrolet dubbed the Lobotomobile. Among his victims was Rosemary Kennedy, sister to future President John F. Kennedy. At just 23 years old, she was left severely disabled for life after undergoing the procedure in 1941. Freeman's obsession with the technique eventually ended in tragedy. His final lobotomy in 1967 resulted in the death of Helen Mortensen, her third time under his instrument. Before lobotomies took hold, another method dominated psychiatric treatment: moral therapy. Rooted in discipline and routine, it treated mental illness as a failure of will. At the Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, Dr. Samuel Woodward mandated rigid schedules filled with manual labor, religious services, and behavioral conditioning. In his 1912 diary, he wrote, "The patient must learn to govern himself, submit to authority, and engage in useful occupation." At New York's Willard State Hospital, this doctrine became extreme. Patients labored up to 12 hours a day, maintaining farms that produced over 2,000 pounds of vegetables and sustained 200 cows. The 1923 superintendent's report boasted that this labor saved $175,000 annually, equivalent to over $2.8 million today. Then came insulin shock therapy, a treatment born not of careful planning but of accident. Austrian psychiatrist Manfred Sackel, experimenting with drug addiction treatments in 1927, discovered that inducing insulin comas seemed to alter patient behavior. The method quickly spread to the U.S. At Pilgrim State Hospital in New York between 1936 and 1945, more than 2,000 patients were subjected to this therapy. Dr. Joseph Wardis reported a cure rate of 88% in schizophrenic patients. Figures later challenged when relapse rates and deaths from coma became undeniable. Dr. Harold Bourne, a critic of the therapy, warned in 1938, "We are not treating diseases. We are treating human beings whose problems cannot be solved by putting them into comas." Yet institutions like Creedmoor State Hospital carried on. In 1940 alone, 450 patients received insulin shock therapy. 17 died. But perhaps no treatment is as infamous or enduring as electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Developed in 1938 by Italian psychiatrists Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini, its first subject was a man found wandering Rome, muttering incoherently. After the first jolt, the man screamed, "Not another one, it's deadly." But they did it again, and again. Eventually, his condition improved. That was enough. Soon, ECT made its way to America. By 1940, it was being administered without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, causing violent convulsions that often led to fractured bones. The treatment was first tested on pigs in slaughterhouses to ensure it didn't kill animals. The horrifying origin was later chronicled in Cerletti's memoir, The History of Electroshock. In Massachusetts, Metropolitan State Hospital reported 1,443 ECT treatments in 1944 alone. Prominent psychiatrist Dr. Abraham Meyerson defended its side effects, especially memory loss, claiming, "These people have more intelligence than they can handle. The reduction of intelligence is a key part of the cure." At Rockland State Hospital, Dr. David Impastato industrialized ECT into a grim assembly line. 100 patients a day wheeled through for treatment like cogs in a machine. Isolation cells, often called quiet rooms, were common in most institutions. At the Friends Asylum in Philadelphia, records from 1915 show 40% of patients spent time in solitary confinement, sometimes for months. At Danvers State Hospital, basement isolation rooms were described as dungeons where the light of day never penetrates. Physical restraints were not a last resort, they were standard. Devices like the Utica crib, a bed enclosed in a wooden cage, and the tranquilizer chair, invented by Dr. Benjamin Rush, were used well into the 1920s. At St. Elizabeth's Hospital, in Washington, D.C., 60% of patients in 1923 experienced some form of restraint. Dr. William Allenson White, superintendent, justified it. Restraint is sometimes necessary, but should be used sparingly. Still, patients were routinely strapped down, tied up and left for days. Another common method was hydrotherapy, promoted as both calming and cleansing. Treatments ranged from ice baths to high-pressure water sprays. Some patients were kept submerged, for days, restrained beneath canvas covers with only their heads exposed. At Buffalo State Hospital, Dr. John Pierce introduced the needle shower in 1902. a machine that fired streams of alternating hot and cold water from every direction. The 1905 annual report boasted, "Some patients receive up to 8 hours of hydrotherapy daily. With no effective medication, experimentation flourished." At Dunning State Hospital in Chicago, Dr. Henry Cotton believed mental illness stemmed from hidden infections. His solution? Remove them, literally. Between 1919 and 1921, Cotton removed the teeth, tonsils, stomachs, and colons of over 1,000 patients with a reported 30% mortality rate. Still, he claimed success. The tragedy deepened when his own son, suffering mental illness, had all his teeth removed following his father's theory. The practice continued until Cotton's death in 1933, long after his peers knew better. By the 1940s, criticism of these treatments began to mount. Journals questioned lobotomies and insulin therapy. But with no real alternatives, the cruelty persisted, and so did the suffering. Actress Frances Farmer, institutionalized in the 1940s, endured insulin shock and isolation. Her memoir, Will There Really Be a Morning, published posthumously in 1972, shattered illusions about mental health care. The treatment rooms were like torture chambers. There was no therapy, only submission. In the end, these experiments didn't cure. They subdued. They erased. They turned pain into silence and humanity into compliance. For decades, asylums across America concealed these horrors behind thick stone walls and tranquil gardens. The treatments they promised were too often tools of domination, cloaked in the language of science. In the dim corridors of early 20th century, asylums, one voice echoed louder than any diagnosis: patriarchy. Between 1900 and 1950, the vast majority of mental asylum populations were women, often not because they were ill, but because they had dared to defy the social norms of the day. Diagnoses like female hysteria and moral insanity became convenient labels to suppress individuality, independence, and resistance. At the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, records from 1907 show that out of 1,432 admitted patients, 987 were women, and over 40% were institutionalized for hysteria. Their symptoms ranged from excessive crying to disobedience to reading novels. This epidemic of female institutionalization was seeded decades earlier by Dr. Benjamin Rush, the so-called father of American psychiatry. In his 1812 treatise, he claimed women's natural sensibility made them more prone to madness. His infamous invention, the tranquilizer chair, was disproportionately used on women. In asylums across North America and Europe, the bar for female insanity was dangerously low. Dr. Edward Shorter, studying the Toronto Asylum's archives, uncovered patterns. Women were routinely admitted for vague, non-medical offenses, excessive novel reading, religious enthusiasm, domestic trouble, or simply on their husband's word. In 1908, 23-year-old Elizabeth Parker was committed by her husband for reading romantic fiction and refusing marital duties. She died 8 years later of tuberculosis, still institutionalized. Women who questioned or resisted male authority were especially vulnerable. In 1910, Mary Adelaide Henderson was institutionalized for reading Penny Dreadfuls and expressing support for women's suffrage. Author Louisa May Alcott, though never institutionalized herself, wrote prophetically in Behind a Mask, "They call it madness when a woman's mind seeks to break free from the chains of domestic tedium." One of the most haunting cases was that of Alice Mitchell, committed to Buffalo State Asylum in 1909. Her crime? A passion for mechanics and so-called masculine pursuits. Her medical file, rediscovered in 1980, contained her handwritten plea: "I am not mad. I simply wish to study engineering. Is this truly a sign of insanity?" She spent 17 years confined and subjected to ice-cold hydrotherapy treatments to quell her unnatural ardor. Her case was cited in textbooks as an example of sexual inversion leading to mental derangement. The institutional war on women went beyond containment. It aimed to reshape them. Dr. George Miller Beard's theory of neurasthenia, essentially, mental collapse from modern life, became a fashionable diagnosis for women who showed any signs of ambition or discontent. By 1910, the Massachusetts State Hospital reported that 40% of female admissions were for neurasthenia. Case files show women institutionalized for everything from playing piano too often to asking too many questions. One of the most disturbing examples is that of Catherine Bartholomew, a suffragette committed in 1912 for political hysteria. Her file, later discovered, included notes about her unnatural excitement over women's rights. Her attending physician, Dr. James Howard, wrote in his private journal, "The woman who seeks to step outside her natural sphere invariably courts nervous collapse." The psychological violence extended even to famous voices. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, writer of The Yellow Wallpaper, was once treated by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, who confined her to bed, banned her from reading or writing, and forbade her from holding her baby. His prescribed rest cure became a symbol of intellectual imprisonment. Gilman later wrote, "I came so close to the edge of utter mental ruin that I could see over." Similarly, Virginia Woolf was subjected to treatments meant to cure her intellectual ambition. Her doctors prescribed marriage, milk, and moral submission. Her diary contains chilling reflections. "These doctors speak of my brain as if it were a child's toy they could wind up or slow down at will." In 1915, one physician even attempted to treat her breakdown by forcing her to drink milk until she vomited. The injustice wasn't just literary, it was systemic. Records from the Nebraska State Hospital in 1915 show that women were 3 times more likely than men to be committed for moral insanity, a diagnosis that included everything from wearing pants to wanting to open a business. One woman, Josephine Crawford, was committed after attempting to start a bicycle repair shop. Her 847-page medical file documents hydrotherapy, force-feeding, and surgical interventions, all aimed at curing her mechanical interests. Perhaps no physician wielded more surgical cruelty than Dr. Henry Cotton. At the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton, Cotton believed women's mental illnesses stemmed from hidden infections, particularly in reproductive organs. Between 1907 and 1930, he orchestrated the removal of thousands of teeth, tonsils, and uteruses. Tragically, his methods gained support. His own son would later be institutionalized and subjected to these same procedures. Some stories pierced the public consciousness. In 1946, Mary Jane Ward published The Snake Pit, a novel based on her stay at Rockland State Hospital. Her portrayal of shock treatments and forced compliance shook the nation. Records from 1940 reveal that 82% of ECT treatments were administered to women. One case stood out. Ruth Morrison, just 19, was committed for excessive dancing and subjected to 67 shock treatments over 6 months. The book led to a congressional investigation and eventually to the Mental Health Act of 1946, though real reform would take decades. The film adaptation starring Olivia de Havilland brought the horror to screens but softened the darkest truths. Long before Ward's exposé, another woman fought the system from within. Elizabeth Packard was committed in 1860 by her husband for questioning his religious views. During her 3-year confinement at Jacksonville Insane Asylum, she secretly documented the stories of 34 other women. Her later book, Modern Persecution, or Insane Asylums Unveiled, included harrowing examples. Sarah Menard, institutionalized for spiritualism, and Mary Shedd, for refusing to attend her husband's church. Packard eventually won her freedom through a jury trial and spent her life campaigning for legal reform, leading to jury trial requirements for commitment in 4 states. Yet by 1927, 15 states still allowed husbands to commit wives without any medical examination or court order. Another trailblazer was Dr. Margaret Cleaves, one of the few female psychiatrists of her time. In her groundbreaking 1913 study, The Autobiography of a Neurasthenic, she chronicled case after case of normal female emotion labeled as madness. Women mourning children, reading foreign novels, or participating in suffrage marches were locked away and treated. Her research paved the way for future feminists like Dr. Phyllis Chesler, whose 1972 book Women and Madness exposed enduring gender bias in psychiatry. This oppression wasn't confined to the U.S. In Paris, the Salpêtrière Hospital under Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot turned women's suffering into spectacle. From 1862 to 1893, Charcot held public hysteria demonstrations where women were posed in front of crowds, photographed mid-seizure, and published in medical journals. One such patient, Augustine, was institutionalized at age 15 after enduring abuse, what we now recognize as PTSD. Across Europe and North America, the message was clear. A woman who stepped outside her assigned role risked being labeled insane, even in seemingly progressive institutions like Mount Pleasant State Hospital in Iowa. Records from 1905 show stark gender differences. Men received occupational therapy and time outdoors. Women were subjected to restraints, isolation, and force-feeding. One case, Margaret Schuyler, was institutionalized after organizing a women's suffrage rally. Her treatment included prolonged solitary confinement and forced sedation. In Tasende, these institutions, women's tears were pathologized, their grief punished, their ambition declared dangerous. The asylum became a mirror of society's deepest fears. A woman with a voice, a mind, or a will of her own. Amid the cold stone corridors, iron restraints, and echoing cries of forgotten asylums, a quiet but determined movement began to rise. It didn't arrive in a flash of revolution, but in the steady footsteps of those who refused to accept cruelty as treatment. In the shadows of abuse and institutional horror, these voices carried a different message, that the mentally ill were not monsters to be confined, but human beings deserving of compassion, dignity, and care. The transformation began in 1841, when a former schoolteacher named Dorothea Dix visited the East Cambridge Jail in Massachusetts. There she found the mentally ill confined alongside criminals, many chained naked to walls in freezing, filthy cells. Appalled by the inhumanity, she began a 40-year crusade to reform mental health care, documenting what she saw with relentless precision. In her 1843 memorial to the Massachusetts legislature, Dix described people confined in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. Her advocacy wasn't just passionate, it was effective. She personally lobbied state legislatures, Congress, and even presidents, helping to establish or expand 32 state psychiatric hospitals, including the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum and the Illinois State Hospital. Her tireless efforts laid the foundation for America's first wave of institutional reform. Across the Atlantic, similar shifts were stirring. In France, physician Philippe Pinel famously removed chains from patients at the Bicêtre Hospital in 1793. His student Jean-Étienne Esquirol expanded these ideas and founded 10 more humane psychiatric facilities. Meanwhile in England, Quaker reformer William Tuke founded the York Retreat in 1796, emphasizing peaceful surroundings and kindness over punishment. His grandson, Samuel Tuke, documented the results in Description of the Retreat, 1813, spreading these ideas across Europe and into the New World. But the movement wasn't just driven by reformers from above. Some of its most powerful voices came from those who had suffered inside the system. One such voice was Elizabeth Packard, forcibly committed in 1860 by her husband for questioning his religious beliefs. After 3 harrowing years at the Jacksonville Insane Asylum, she emerged determined to fight back. Her book, The Prisoners' Hidden Life, documented 34 other women institutionalized under similar circumstances. Packard's activism led to the passage of the Illinois Packard Law in 1869, which required a jury trial before commitment, a landmark victory. Over the next decade, she successfully lobbied for legal reforms in 4 additional states, challenging the unchecked power of husbands and doctors to silence women through psychiatry. In the early 20th century, another powerful story ignited: the public conscience. In 1909, Clifford Beers, a Yale graduate and former asylum patient, published A Mind That Found Itself, a raw account of abuse and neglect during his institutionalization. He described being strapped in a straitjacket for 21 nights, fed food unfit for animals, and subjected to casual violence by staff. His story sparked national outrage and led to the creation of the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, which later evolved into the National Mental Health Association. Beers wasn't just telling his own story, he was building a movement. The committee brought together psychiatrists, educators, and former patients to advocate for prevention, early intervention, and humane care. It was a radical shift away from the lock-them-away mentality that had dominated for decades. One of the most influential medical voices in the movement was Dr. Adolf Meyer, a Swiss-American psychiatrist who became director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Meyer revolutionized treatment by focusing on the whole person, not just their symptoms. He introduced occupational therapy, individualized care plans, and dramatically reduced the use of physical restraints by over 80% during his tenure. His philosophy, rooted in observation, empathy, and holistic care, set the stage for modern psychiatric practice. On the ground, the revolution continued with figures like Linda Richards, America's first trained nurse. In 1882, she founded the first psychiatric nursing program, emphasizing communication, dignity, and trust. By 1915, her methods had trained over 500 nurses, who spread compassionate care practices across the country. Perhaps no reform hit the public harder than the work of Nellie Bly, a young journalist who faked mental illness in 1887 to gain entry to Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum in New York. For 10 days, she lived as a patient, enduring the same cold baths, rotting food, and verbal abuse that others suffered daily. Her expose, 10 Days in a Madhouse, caused a national scandal and prompted a grand jury investigation. The result? New York allocated $850,000, a staggering sum at the time, to improve its public institutions. Bly's bravery not only revealed the horrors of asylums, but inspired journalistic accountability that would become a model for investigative reporting. Meanwhile, groundbreaking contributions were also being made by Black and female pioneers, long ignored in mainstream narratives. Dr. Solomon Carter Fuller, the first African-American psychiatrist in the U.S., made significant strides in understanding schizophrenia. Rejecting the punitive norms of the era, he emphasized occupational therapy and human connection over restraints. His work proved that recovery was possible without cruelty. In 1913, Mary Jarrett, a visionary social worker, began integrating social services into mental health care. Working at the Boston Psychopathic Hospital, she showed that patients improved more rapidly when their home lives, financial struggles, and social contexts were addressed. Her model became the standard for psychiatric institutions by 1920. That same year, Dr. Anna Besant Taylor introduced group therapy at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. She noticed that structured social interaction among patients reduced the need for sedation and promoted healing. Her groundbreaking success led to the nationwide adoption of group therapy, a method now central to mental health treatment. These reformers didn't work in isolation. They were part of a rising tide that demanded the deinstitutionalization of cruelty, and they slowly replaced isolation with care, force with understanding, and silence with voice. Their work planted the seeds for mid-20th century reforms, and though change came slowly, it came because they refused to stop fighting. Asylums began to shift from places of fear to sites of reform. New policies emphasized voluntary admission, individualized treatment, and patient rights. While abuse and neglect still haunted many institutions, the efforts of these pioneers made it impossible to ignore that another way was possible. Psychiatrist Franco Basaglia would later summarize the goal of this movement. The asylum is not a fortress to conquer, it is a mistake to correct. And corrected it was, though only partially and never fast enough. As the 20th century marched forward, the great asylums that once loomed like castles over quiet hillsides began to cast a different kind of shadow. Their spires, once symbols of curative optimism, had become monuments to suffering, to a time when mental illness was misunderstood, mistreated, and often deliberately silenced. The post-war years brought with them a growing unease. By the 1940s, medical journals had begun publishing critical studies challenging the efficacy of lobotomies, insulin shock therapy, and electroconvulsive treatments. Skepticism was growing, but for too many it came too late. Despite mounting evidence of harm, many institutions continued these practices into the 1950s and beyond, largely because there were no true alternatives. Medications like Thorazine were still emerging and public understanding of mental health remained limited. Within asylum walls, change was slow and often resisted. But outside, voices were rising, voices that refused to let the suffering go unheard. Among the most powerful was that of Frances Farmer, the Hollywood actress institutionalized in the 1940s. Her memoir, Will There Really Be a Morning, published after her death in 1972, gave the public a devastating glimpse into the brutal treatments she endured. Farmer described being forcibly subjected to insulin shock therapy, cold hydrotherapy, isolation, and restraints, not as a path to healing, but as tools of punishment. Her story helped humanize the plight of the institutionalized and added momentum to calls for reform. By the 1960s, the tide began to shift. A growing civil rights movement brought attention to the rights of patients as part of a broader conversation on dignity, liberty, and bodily autonomy. It became increasingly clear that mental illness did not justify cruelty, and confinement could no longer be synonymous with care. This period also marked the beginning of deinstitutionalization, the large-scale movement to shut down or dramatically reduce the size of mental institutions across the United States. By the 1970s and 80s, many of the massive asylums that had once housed thousands stood empty or decaying. Some were demolished, while others were converted into museums, office buildings, or condominiums, architectural relics of a troubled past. But bricks and mortar weren't the only legacies left behind. The architectural vision that once inspired Kirkbride's therapeutic model had become a haunting reminder of how well-intentioned ideals can be corrupted. The buildings were beautiful, yes, but beauty had often masked horror. The towers and arches had not healed minds. They had contained them, hiding the cries of the suffering behind stained glass and sandstone. Still, within that darkness there had always been those who dared to believe in something better. Figures like Dorothea Dix, Elizabeth Packard, Adolph Meyer, and Nellie Bly showed that change was possible, not in sweeping revolutions, but in patient, persistent advocacy. Their efforts proved that compassion could challenge cruelty, and science could evolve beyond experimentation into empathy. And though many of their victories were partial or delayed, their legacy lives on in every modern mental health initiative that emphasizes dignity, consent, and person-centered care. Today, we understand that mental illness is not a moral failing or a sign of weakness. We recognize the power of trauma, the influence of environment, and the necessity of therapeutic support systems. But the road here was not inevitable. It was paved with the voices of those who were ignored, institutionalized, and buried under diagnoses that often served more to control than to heal. Places like the Buffalo State Hospital, Danvers, and Greystone Park are now largely remembered through photographs, news clippings, and ghost tours. Their legacy lives on not just in haunted stories, but in the real human cost, the lives spent within their walls, too often forgotten. But remembering is a form of justice. To revisit these histories is not to dwell on horror, but to understand how far we've come and how much further we must go. Mental health reform is not a chapter that has closed. Even today, disparities in care, access, and diagnosis persist. Stigmas remain, and systems too often fail the vulnerable. The great asylums may have crumbled, but the lessons they offer still stand tall. They remind us that care must be guided by respect, not fear. That science must walk hand in hand with ethics. That no structure, no matter how grand, can ever be a substitute for humanity. As we stand in the 21st century, equipped with knowledge those early reformers could only dream of, we carry their message forward. Healing must begin with listening. Psychiatrist Franco Basaglia, a leading voice in closing Italy's asylums, once said, "The asylum is not a fortress to conquer. It is a mistake to correct." That correction is still ongoing. Thank you for walking these halls of history, where beauty and brutality coexisted, and where silence was eventually broken by courage. Until next time, keep seeking truth in the forgotten corners of the past. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we were never supposed to hear.